She was 9 years old. She wore pigtails. She bowed with both hands wrapped around a small potted apple tree. The most feared crime boss in the country accepted it with a smile. He was dead before the next harvest. They said Ryan June was unkillable. 16 assassination attempts in 23 years. A car bomb in the Southport that vaporized the vehicle in front of his and left him walking away with a torn sleeve. A sniper round that passed through 3 inches of bulletproof glass and still only grazed his ear. Poisoned wine at a rooftop gala that killed 2 men who shared his bottle but somehow skipped the one man it was poured for. He had survived everything the underworld threw at him with the settled indifference of someone who had simply stopped believing death applied to him personally. He controlled the White Tiger Syndicate, which stretched from the city's pharmaceutical supply chains to the eastern seaport, from legitimate construction companies to the darkest corners of the country's financial exchanges. His name was spoken carefully in boardrooms and not mentioned at all in certain neighborhoods where his word was the only law that counted. 17 years of law enforcement pressure, 2 national task forces built specifically to dismantle him, both dissolved, both failed. He was not brought down by a rival organization. He was not betrayed by a lieutenant. He was not cornered by a prosecutor with a thick file and a political career to protect. He was brought down by a girl named Mina, age 9. A girl with pigtails, botanical scissors, and a patience so complete it made grown men go quiet when they finally understood what she had done. She had been planning it since she was 4 years old. She had never once been in a hurry. The most dangerous mistake a powerful man can make is not the enemy he forgets to watch. It is the one he decides is not worth watching at all. Ryan June had a rule his lieutenants called the Iron Gate. No one entered his private estate without clearing 4 layers, biometric scanners at the perimeter wall, armed escorts at every corridor junction, a full electronic sweep for recording devices, and the personal sign-off of his head of household. No exceptions, no guests uninvited, no sentiment. The rule had stood for 19 years without a single breach. The rule had one loophole. It had been there for 3 years. It weighed less than 30 kilograms and was currently drawing a picture of a leaf in a sketchbook. Her name in the visitor log read simply, Daniel's granddaughter. Daniel was the estate's head gardener, a quiet man who had tended Ryan June's grounds for 11 years and was one of perhaps 5 people on Earth the boss trusted without examination. Not because Daniel was powerful in any syndicate sense, but because he grew things, extraordinary things, roses that bloomed through winter, a fig wall along the east corridor that 3 visiting horticulturalists had asked to photograph, an orchard in the back garden that produced fruit so consistent and beautiful it felt deliberate in a way that nature rarely manages. In a life built entirely on concrete and control, Daniel's garden was the one soft thing Ryan June permitted himself. The granddaughter, Mina, had begun coming to the estate 3 years ago when she was 6. She was quiet and small, with a gap between her front teeth and a battered sketchbook she carried everywhere. She drew plants. She asked careful questions and listened to every answer with the focused attention of someone who intended to remember. Ryan June had watched her from the east corridor window sometimes and found the sight of it inexplicably calming in a life that had very few calming things. He was not a man who liked children. He was not a man who liked most people. But there was something about the girl, the deliberateness of her, the way she never spoke unless she had something worth saying, that reminded him of himself before the world had finished making him what he was. He had, without quite deciding to, allowed her access to the inner garden, then to the greenhouse. Then, on cold mornings when she arrived early and needed somewhere warm to wait, to the east corridor sitting room with the south-facing window. His security director had flagged the access twice. Ryan June had overridden both flags personally. This was the only mistake he ever made. It was a very complete one. Every person in that compound saw a quiet girl who loved plants. She needed every single one of them to keep seeing exactly that and nothing else. Mina was not a child in the way that word is usually meant. She was biologically 9 years old, small for her age, with a sketchbook she had been filling with botanical diagrams since she was 5. To every camera in the compound, she was precisely the granddaughter of a gardener. She had made herself look that way for 3 years, one Tuesday at a time. But Mina had been enrolled in a program that did not officially exist since before she could read. The program was called Project Hemlock, and it was the most classified operation in the country's intelligence service history. Its founding logic was simple, ruthless, and considered nearly impossible, that sophisticated criminal organizations had evolved beyond the reach of conventional intelligence work, and that the only way to penetrate them at the highest level was through an asset so improbable, so far beneath suspicion, that their presence would not register as a threat at all, not background noise. Wallpaper. Project Hemlock had been running for 40 years. It had produced 3 field assets. 2 were dead. The third was a 10-year-old girl currently repotting a fig cutting in a greenhouse north of the city. She had not been recruited. She had been born into it. Daniel, the gardener, the quiet man with soil-stained hands who had tended Ryan June's estate for 11 years, had been an intelligence deep-cover operative since before Mina's mother was born. His skill with plants was entirely genuine. So was the cover. So was the posting. So was the patience that had kept him in place for 11 years without a single flag. Mina's mother had been a program analyst. She died in a car accident when Mina was 3. The accident was flagged in an internal intelligence review 4 years later as a possible neutralization event, meaning someone had caused it deliberately to protect the organization her mother had been working to dismantle. Mina found that review when she was 7 years old, inside a hidden surveillance room behind a false wall in the east wing of the estate she was infiltrating. She filed it in her memory. She did not cry. She worked faster. When she was 4, the program had presented Daniel with a choice: relocate the child under a new identity or continue with an adjusted structure. He had agonized for 3 weeks. Then he sat across from Mina at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open between them and asked what she wanted. She said she wanted to finish what her mother started. He began teaching her that afternoon and did not stop. By 6, she could identify 47 toxic plant species by touch alone in complete darkness and explain the metabolic pathway of every compound without notes. By 7, she had memorized every floor plan the intelligence service held for the Ryan estate and had begun noting where the plans were wrong. By 8, she was inside the compound every week without anyone looking at her twice. By 9, she had identified the method. A Fuji apple sapling, grown by her own hands over 14 months in Daniel's private greenhouse 2 kilometers from the estate, using a cultivation technique the program called Silent Root, a compound 40 years in development. It bound itself to the cellular structure of growing fruit at concentrations undetectable by any existing screening method, harmless in any single exposure, cumulative over time. After approximately 16 weeks of regular consumption, the threshold was crossed. Past that point, the effects were systemic and irreversible without specialist medical intervention that took months to locate and administer. The tree had been growing for 14 months. It was Tuesday, time to bring it inside. She chose Tuesday because Tuesdays put him in a good mood. She wore yellow because yellow reads as harmless. She carried the tree with both hands and bowed when she set it down. Not one person in that compound gave it a second look. She painted the pot herself. Small, careful drawings of apple blossoms in the same ink she had been using in her sketchbook for 2 years. The compound's security cameras had been recording her fill that sketchbook since she was 6. Continuity mattered. Familiarity made people stop watching. The tree was the healthiest small apple sapling anyone on the estate had ever seen. Deep green leaves, 3 small fruits already forming despite its youth. This was unusual enough to earn admiring attention rather than suspicion, which was exactly the kind of attention she needed. She brought it to the East Corridor sitting room on a Tuesday morning, set it on the table beside the south-facing window, and opened her sketchbook. Ryan June found her there 15 minutes later. He had begun, over the past year, to drift through the East Corridor on Tuesday mornings the way that powerful men sometimes drift toward the few things in their lives that ask nothing of them. He stood in the doorway looking at the tree. "You grew that yourself," he said. She stood and bowed the way she always did when he entered a room. It was correct form. It also gave her 2 seconds to read him, his posture, his color, his mood, before she had to speak. "Yes, sir, 14 months. It is a Fuji. I thought the East Corridor did not get enough light for most plants, but a south-facing window is exactly right for a fruit tree." She let a small hesitation into her voice, the kind that read as uncertainty. "I hope that was all right to bring." He studied the 3 small fruits on the branches. They were pale gold, improbably well formed for a tree this size and age. "You want me to keep it here," he said. "If it pleases you, sir. It will fruit properly in about 3 months. Fuji apples are very sweet. My grandfather says you rarely eat sweet things." Something moved in his face, not quite softness. The shadow of what softness had once felt like in a man who had spent 2 decades carefully removing it from himself. He told her to leave it. She walked down the corridor, through the security checkpoint, past the guards who had stopped really looking at her 18 months ago, out through the gate, and down the hill to Daniel's car parked at the base of the road. She sat in the passenger seat and counted 60 seconds before she let herself breathe out. The tree was inside. The clock was running. The most patient intelligence operation in history looked, for 4 months, like a little girl watering a plant on Tuesday mornings. That was not a coincidence. That was the entire architecture. She came every Tuesday and Thursday, without variation. She watered the tree, she checked the soil, she adjusted the pot's position as the light angle shifted with the season. She answered Ryan June's questions about it. He began asking more as the weeks went on, which she had anticipated, with the accurate enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved the subject, which she did. Her knowledge of plants was not cover. It was the one part of her life that had never been entirely operational, and she was not sorry for that. The tree fruited fully in the 3rd month. 6 apples, pale gold, perfect weight for a tree this young. He ate the first one on a Wednesday evening. She was not present. She did not need to be. She had spent 3 years learning the rhythms of a man who controlled his entire world by controlling every variable in it, and who had allowed himself, in the specific space of his own garden, the rare luxury of not controlling quite everything. The head of household, Mrs. Clara, who documented the estate's daily operations in meticulous written reports, noted that the boss had eaten the first apple from the girl's tree and declared it the finest fruit he had ever tasted. He asked her to make sure the girl knew. Mrs. Clara told Mina the following Tuesday. Mina bowed and said she was very glad to hear it. She went back to checking the soil. The tree produced fruit 4 times over 4 months. Ryan June ate every apple it yielded. He offered one to Commander Blake, his head of security, who ate it and found it excellent. Mina noted this and quietly extended her operational timeline by 19 days to account for Blake's incidental exposure. He offered one to Sophia, his cousin and second in command. Sophia declined due to a fruit allergy. Mina noted this too. She filed it under complications that resolved themselves. He kept every other apple for himself. This was unusual behavior for a man who did not, as a general rule, place value on individual things. The program's director, reading Daniel's operational report that month with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent 30 years not showing excitement in documents, made a single note in the file. Phase 3 confirmed, timeline nominal. He blamed the fatigue on overwork. He blamed the headaches on stress. He blamed the tremor in his right hand on age. He had a reasonable explanation for everything except the right one. It started in the 9th week. Ryan June maintained his body like a professional instrument. 5 kilometers every morning, monthly physicals with his private physician, no smoking, controlled drinking, exactly 7 hours of sleep in a room swept for chemical agents before dawn. He had kept this discipline for 15 years because he understood that the tool, has to be cared for. The fatigue that appeared in week 9 did not respond to the run. This was the first thing he noticed, and he noticed it immediately. He mentioned it to Dr. Shane, his private physician, without mentioning the occasional pressure behind his sternum or the fact that his sleep had become, for the first time in 2 decades, irregular. He was not a man who disclosed weakness comprehensively. Dr. Shane ran a full panel. Everything came back within normal range. He recommended more water and fewer late evenings. Ryan June increased his water intake. He did not reduce the evenings. The syndicate was in its most aggressive legitimate expansion in 10 years. He was working long days because the work required it. He blamed the fatigue on the schedule. This was reasonable. In week 12, his right hand trembled during a meeting. 4 seconds. No one in the room acknowledged it because acknowledging it was not something anyone in that room survived. He noticed it himself. He said nothing. In week 14, a headache lasted 3 days. Dr. Shane returned. Neurological panel, normal. Recommendation, rest and stress reduction. In week 16, Ryan June stood at the east corridor window looking at the apple tree and felt something he had not experienced in his adult life. Uncertainty about his own physical self. He did not have an immediate name for it because it was entirely new. He was standing there when Mina arrived with Daniel on Thursday morning. She read him in under 3 seconds, the compensatory stillness in his right shoulder, the slight shift in his skin tone, the way he was holding his posture with the careful precision of someone managing something he would not name. She was on track. She was, in fact, 19 days ahead of her projected timeline. She bowed. She asked about the tree. She trimmed 2 small dead leaves from the lower branches with the scissors she always carried. "You are very careful with it," he said. "I have been growing it for a long time," she said, dropping the clippings into the small bag she always brought. "When you take care of something for a long time, you stop being careless with it." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you always plan this far ahead?" His voice had something in it, not quite suspicion, the professional instinct of a man who had survived 20 years by trusting that instinct above everything else. She looked up at him, 9 years old, gap between her front teeth, botanical scissors in her hand. "My grandfather says a gardener who does not plan for next season will not have a garden next season," she said. He thought about this for a moment. "Smart old man," he said, and walked away. She went back to trimming. Her hands did not shake. For 11 years, the most valuable deep-cover operative in the country's intelligence history had been on his knees in a crime boss's garden with soil under his fingernails. The garden was not the cover. The garden was the weapon. What Daniel had built inside the estate over 11 years was not a surveillance post. It was an ecosystem. The estate's irrigation network, installed by Daniel during his 2nd year of employment, contained microfilament sensors that had been transmitting soil composition data for 9 years. The rose collection along the west wall had been, for 6 of those years, a biological monitoring array. The compounds they released were imperceptible to any person walking past them, but detectable to a receiver Daniel had integrated into the greenhouse ventilation panel during a routine maintenance cycle. The oldest tree in the orchard, a mature fig that visitors consistently admired, contained within its root system a data relay device so small and so precisely embedded in the wood that it had survived 11 full security sweeps without detection. Daniel had installed it in year 3. It had been transmitting ever since. He had built all of this himself. The program had given him the tools and the posting. He had designed the architecture over 11 seasons. Without instructions, not because he was ordered to exceed his brief, because he had spent 11 years watching what the White Tiger Syndicate was, and he had stopped being willing to simply record it. 300 documented deaths, 47 corrupted public officials, a pharmaceutical contamination that had reached 100,000 patients through supply chains the syndicate controlled. communities hollowed by substances his employer produced. He had kneeled in that garden and watched all of it, one season at a time, and he had built his trap accordingly. Mina had not been the original plan. She had been the adaptation that made the plan complete, the variable that transformed a 30-year intelligence architecture into something faster and more decisive than anything the program had originally imagined. She had been 4 years old when she said she wanted to finish what her mother started. He had spent 5 years teaching her, 3 more watching her surpass him. The last year watching her execute something more elegant and more patient than anything he could have designed himself. He was proud of her in the way he carried everything, quietly and without saying so. He was also afraid, not of failure, but of what success would require her to carry afterward. He said nothing about this. She would have found it unhelpful. They had built the compound to survive every known attack vector: car bombs, snipers, turned lieutenants, corrupt officials. Not one of them had a protocol for a potted tree on a windowsill. Ryan June's inner circle was 4 people. Sophia, his cousin and second in command, the one relationship he had never questioned, and the one person in the organization whose loyalty he held as an absolute. Commander Blake, head of security, former special forces, methodical and precise, and completely without imagination in exactly the right way for his profession. Dr. Shane, personal physician, medical discretion verified by 3 separate background investigations over 9 years of employment. And Director Leon, head of intelligence, 15 years building the syndicate's counterintelligence operation, one of the most competent private sector operators in the country. Not one of them saw it coming. Blake had run full background checks on Daniel when he was hired, and again 3 years ago when Mina began accompanying him. Both clear. The man was a gardener of extraordinary skill with no known affiliations outside his profession. The girl was his granddaughter. Both were entirely and verifiably what they appeared to be. The security team had flagged Mina's unsupervised compound access twice. Ryan June had personally overridden both flags. In the operational log, this was recorded as a principal-level authorization. Protocol required no further escalation. Director Leon, in 18 months of Mina's expanded access, had never run a secondary analysis on the apple tree. Trees were not in the threat matrix. A potted sapling carried in by a child who had been visiting the estate for 3 years without incident was indistinguishable from background. This was the single largest oversight in the White Tiger Syndicate's 23-year operational history. It was also entirely understandable, which was precisely the point. The compound's screening protocols were exceptional by any standard. All food deliveries tested, all prepared meals tasted before reaching Ryan June, drinks screened, medications verified, air quality in private rooms monitored monthly. None of these protocols were designed to screen a living plant that the principal had personally invited inside, maintained by a child he had grown fond of, producing fruit he chose to eat because it tasted like something he remembered from a time before he became what he was. Every entry point into that compound had been hardened against attack. Except Patience. Patience had walked in 3 years ago on a Tuesday morning carrying a sketchbook and had been invisible ever since. He had survived every kind of violence the underworld could produce. The one thing that finally reached him was not more violent, it was simply more patient than he had the capacity to imagine. It was week 17. Ryan June called his inner circle at 7 in the morning, unscheduled, which communicated everything without a word. He sat at the head of the conference table in the lower level, correct posture, controlled expression, his right hand resting flat on the table with the deliberate stillness of a man working against his own body. Sophia noticed. Full security review, he said. Everything, every staff member, every supplier, every access event in the past 2 years, new methodology, nothing carried over from previous reviews. No one asked why. You did not ask why in that room. The gardener, Sophia said, And the girl. The room went quiet in a particular way. She is a child, Blake said. She is a child who has had compound access for 3 years and who brought a living plant inside 5 months ago, Sophia said. Her voice was flat and even. When did the symptoms begin? Ryan June looked at his cousin for a long moment. Test the tree, everything, bring in outside specialists, not domestic, find the best forensic botanist on the continent. He paused. Find the girl and Daniel, bring them in carefully, no alarm. Leon was already reaching for his phone. Tree first, Ryan June said, then we know what we are dealing with. The tree was removed from the east corridor and taken to the secure testing room within the hour. Standard toxicology, extended botanical alkaloid screening, heavy metals panel, a sample sent by courier to the independent laboratory the syndicate used for sensitive external analysis. All results negative. A healthy Fuji apple sapling, fruit chemistry consistent with a standard Fuji variety, nothing anomalous, nothing actionable. Leon delivered this report to Ryan June personally. Ryan June read it, set it down. Send it to a military-grade facility, he said. I do not care what it costs or what attention it draws. I want a screen for compounds that civilian laboratories do not have protocols for. That will take 4 days, Leon said. Find the girl first, Ryan June said. Blake's phone was already at his ear. He lowered it slowly. They are gone, he said. Daniel and the girl. The house has been empty since this morning. Rent paid 3 months forward. No forwarding address, no trace. Silence in the room. Ryan June looked at the table, at his right hand, which he was no longer working to hold still. 3 years, he said quietly. She was 6 when she started coming here. No one spoke. 14 months on the tree, 3 years building the access. Daniel, 11 years inside this compound. He was quiet for a long time. How long has the threshold been crossed? He asked, to no one in particular. Dr. Shane, who had not spoken until this moment, answered carefully. Based on the onset timeline, if the compound follows a cumulative absorption model, somewhere between 2 and 5 weeks ago, possibly longer. Ryan June closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted in his expression. Not fear, something older than fear. The recognition that arrives when a man who has built his entire life on being the most patient person in any room finally meets someone who simply outweighted him. I would have hired her, he said. And for the first time in 23 years, in a room full of people who had never seen it, Ryan June smiled. The most powerful crime boss in the country did not fall to a bomb or a bullet or a turned lieutenant. He fell to a 9-year-old's apple tree and 16 weeks of Tuesday mornings that nobody thought to question. Dr. Shane worked through the night. He was skilled, he had the equipment. He could not treat what he could not identify, and Silent Route, designed over 40 years specifically to evade existing screening protocols, gave him nothing to identify. The cardiac irregularity was real and worsening. The systemic profile matched nothing in the published literature. It looked exactly like the natural deterioration of a high-stress body over a high-stress career, which was precisely how it had been designed to look. By the time it became visible, it had been building for 4 months. Sophia stopped him from calling an ambulance. No hospitals, no records. A hospital admission triggers everything. She was right about this. A visible collapse at a medical facility would activate rival contingency plans within hours, would signal the kind of weakness that had only one response in their world. She was also wrong, in the way that people who protect systems sometimes protect the system at the cost of the person inside it. Dr. Shane stabilized the arrhythmia. He could not address what was underneath it. 3 days later, Ryan June was moved by private transport to a specialist medical facility abroad under a false identity. The attending physicians there would work for 8 months and describe the condition as unlike anything in the published literature. He survived. He was not, afterward, what he had been before. The White Tiger Syndicate did not survive his absence. 3 months of leadership uncertainty, internal rivalry, and the precisely timed release of the syndicate's full financial records through anonymous channels that investigators traced back to a server that no longer existed, produced a structural collapse that 17 years of direct law enforcement pressure had been unable to achieve. 47 officials named, 3 pharmaceutical executives arrested, a sitting government representative under investigation, a decade of port manipulation, supply chain fraud, and criminal finance exposed and dismantled in a single sustained operation. The anonymous source was never identified. She was 9 years old when she finished what her mother started. She was 10 when the program told her she could rest. She planted a fig tree instead. Mina and Daniel left the city on the same Tuesday morning. The compound's security team discovered the house was empty. They drove north to a small property with a garden that backed onto a creek and a greenhouse Daniel had been quietly stocking with the right equipment over the previous 6 months. On her first morning there, Mina sat at the kitchen table and wrote her operational report. 49 pages, every decision documented, every adaptation noted, every moment where discovery had been possible and how it was avoided, the 7 timeline adjustments, the 3 close calls, an appendix covering everything she had learned about the syndicate's internal structure, political connections, and financial network during 3 years of estate access. She submitted it to the program's secure server. Then she planted a fig cutting in a pot by the greenhouse window. The program's director read the report in a single sitting. He was 61 years old. He had run field operations for 3 decades. He had long since stopped being surprised by his assets. He was surprised by this report. Not by the operational competence. He had expected that. He was surprised by the appendix, by 3 names she had connected to a political protection network the intelligence service had spent 11 years trying to verify, by a supplementary note on page 46, written in handwriting that was still partly a child's, identifying the White Tiger Syndicate's primary government protector as someone connected to the original authorization of Project Hemlock itself, 18 years ago. He read that page 3 times. Then he called the deputy director. "We need to discuss the asset," he said. "She is 9 years old," the deputy director said. "She turns 10 in 3 weeks. She has already identified the next target before we asked." He paused. "She says she is thinking about figs." Silence on the line. "Figs take longer than apples," the deputy director said slowly. "She says figs are better for targets with multiple layers of protection, deeper root system, more patient cultivation window." He looked out the window at the city. "She says she is not in a hurry." The deputy director sat with this for a long moment. "Give her the greenhouse," she said. "Give her everything she asks for, and make sure no one in this organization ever underestimates her. Not now, not ever again." When the White Tiger fell, it did not fall alone. One little girl's apple tree turned out to have very long roots, reaching all the way into offices where people had spent decades believing they were completely untouchable. The financial records, released through the anonymous channel, contained material that prosecutors described as the most significant criminal financial disclosure in the country's organized crime history. 47 names, city planning officials, a former deputy minister, a senior financial intelligence officer who had spent 9 years redirecting major investigations away from syndicate interests, 3 pharmaceutical executives whose companies had been producing controlled substances through syndicate manufacturing channels for 7 years. And 1 name connected to something much older. A sealed document from 40 years ago, a funding authorization for Project Hemlock, in the margin, in handwriting that had since become very powerful. If this program becomes inconvenient, assets can be reclassified and removed. No operational record survives reclassification. Mina's mother had died in a car accident when Mina was 3 years old. The internal flag on that accident, possible neutralization event, had been buried in a closed archive for 6 years before a 7-year-old girl found it behind a false wall in an estate she was infiltrating. She had included it in Appendix 4 of her operational report. One paragraph, clear handwriting, no visible emotion in the prose. The audit that followed took 4 months. It found 11 additional points of compromise inside the intelligence service itself. 3 redirected cases, 2 burned informants, 1 operation terminated early by an instruction from an office that had no authority to issue it. The man responsible, now retired, was arrested on a Thursday morning. He was 63 years old. He had believed, for 40 years, that he was protected by the architecture he had helped build. He had not accounted for a 9-year-old girl with a 14-month apple tree and no interest in being in a hurry. She had finished what her mother started. Then the intelligence service called and told her what her mother had actually been doing when she died, and Mina realized she had not finished anything. She had only just found the right starting point. Mina was repotting the fig cutting when the call came through. She cleaned her hands. She took the call. The deputy director spoke for 9 minutes. She was precise and honest and did not soften anything, which Mina found respectful. Mina listened without interrupting. "I already knew about the accident," Mina said when the 9 minutes were over. The deputy director was very still. "I found the internal flag in the estate archive, week 4 of my first year. The syndicate had kept a copy as leverage. I photographed it and included it in my documentation." A silence. "You were 7 years old," the deputy director said. "Yes," Mina said. "I was very angry." Another silence. "I am not angry anymore," she said. "Anger is inefficient. I have been planning instead." The deputy director looked at the ceiling of her office. "What have you been planning?" she said. "You have the syndicate records now, the 47 names, the audit findings, everything needed to dismantle the protection network that kept the syndicate operational for 18 years. A pause. "You are missing one piece." "What piece?" "The offshore account network. The political protection ran through a financial structure that the syndicate records reference but do not detail. Those details are in a separate archive that was never kept on the estate." A pause. "Do you know where it is?" the deputy director asked. A longer pause from Mina's end. "I grew a fig tree for the man who maintains it. I started it 4 weeks ago. Figs take longer than apples. I expect it will be ready in about 6 months." The deputy director sat in her office on the 14th floor of the intelligence building and looked at the wall for a long time. "What do you need?" she said finally. "Greenhouse space, good soil, time," Mina thought for a moment, "and my grandfather stays employed. He is the best gardener I have ever known, and I am not done learning from him." The man who had been the most feared crime boss in the country was in a recovery clinic abroad, learning to hold a pen without trembling. The girl who had brought him there was in a greenhouse, hands in soil, planning the next season. She was not in a hurry. She had never been. Ryan June recovered. This surprised people who had preferred another outcome. The specialist physicians reversed enough of the silent root compounds effects over 8 months of intensive work that he regained most of his baseline physical function. The tremor in his right hand never fully resolved. Certain patterns of cognition that he did not discuss remained altered in ways that a man of his self-awareness understood precisely. He did not return home. He lived under a false identity in a small coastal town where the main industry was fishing and nobody knew his name. He had a garden. He had hired a local man to teach him to grow tomatoes, which he was not good at yet, but which he was getting better at slowly, because patience was no longer something he performed. It was something that had been installed in him, against his will, over 16 weeks of Tuesdays. He thought about Mina sometimes. Not with anger. He had been in the world long enough to know that resenting a superior strategist was a waste of whatever time you had left. He thought about her with something closer to the respect he reserved for the very few people who had ever genuinely outmaneuvered him. He thought about what she had said in the East Corridor about the tree. When you take care of something for a long time, you stop being careless with it. He thought about what he had taken care of over 23 years. He thought about what he had been careless with. He tended his tomatoes. In the greenhouse north of the city, Mina's fig tree was bearing fruit. She harvested on a Tuesday because Tuesdays were the day she had always done the things that mattered. She brought 4 figs to the kitchen where Daniel was making tea and set them on the table without ceremony. "Ready," she said. He looked at the figs, then at his granddaughter, who was 10 years old and had the hands of someone who spent a great deal of time in soil and the eyes of someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking. "Your mother would." "I know," she said gently. "I know exactly what she would say." He poured 2 cups of tea. They sat at the kitchen table, with the figs between them and the greenhouse visible through the window, and the creek running behind the garden, steady and patient, and indifferent to everything that had been decided nearby. The program's director received a 4-word message that evening. "First yield next season." He forwarded it to the deputy director with a single note. "She is thinking about pears, says the cultivation window is longer but the root system goes deeper, says she does not mind waiting." The deputy director read this sitting in her car outside her building at the end of a very long day. She sat with it for a moment. Then she laughed, real, unprofessional, completely genuine, the kind of laugh that arrives when something is so precisely what it is that describing it feels unnecessary. She typed back 2 words. "Order pears." If you believe the most dangerous force in the world is not speed or strength or violence, but patience, then you already understand Mina. Subscribe now and never underestimate what grows slowly. An end.